concept did you say here? Function?
We did this yesterday, but I went over it. I spent like all of yesterday, basically from AM to, like 4 PM or something, just sitting trying to clarify a bunch of things.
Yeah.
Man, it was hard. Like, anyway, this is what I got understanding to. Going off your grasp, I got it down to that, which is I still don't really know. It still feels kind of like floating in a way, but it's better. It's definitely a little clearer. What are your thoughts on that?
I've changed the kind of conceptual grasp. And this this is defining understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're just saying it's a kind of grasp. That's all you said before, which you got the genus there. A kind of. Okay, then the differentia, it identifies a concept or proposition, relationship to reality, and other concepts. Okay, does that differentiate quite enough, you think? Let's compare it to your near relatives.
So the reason I came up with that is because I was thinking like, well, we don't have, the only reason the term comes up in the first place, or the word or the concept comes up in the first place, is because there is that distinction between perceptual and conceptual. And so we don't speak of understanding a tree. You just see the tree. But when it comes to ideas and concepts, then suddenly there's a necessity for that concept to come up, because suddenly you can have a concept but not perceive what it is clearly. You don't actually know how to use it. You don't know what it's referring to. And so that's why the concept comes up. And that's where I came up with this idea of like, oh, that's what it is. Okay.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. But okay, so we got, yeah, I mean, it looks right. I thought I had a counterexample, or why it might not be, or something we might want to make it a little more distinguished. So I mean,
yeah,
that
let
way,
me know, because I've got
your
questions
genus tree
about that
looks
anyway.
good. That looks good. I like the way that looks. I mean, I wouldn't do it the same way, but this is completely valid, and yeah, it works. It's valid. You can reduce it rather. Is really what you're saying. Let's see. Understanding. Well, you just didn't specify that. I don't think you specified enough of conceptual grasp identifying a concept. Like what is it you're saying is a greater degree or something? Like what's the difference between grasping that you see something, for example?
I said conceptual grasp, identifying a concept or proposition's relationship to reality. So like what the reference are is what I was getting at. What it refers to is, so like, because in the examples I gave, I said, someone asks me to meet at a certain time and location, and I know what that means, like where to go and what time, if they say 3 o'clock, I know what specific thing that refers to. Oh, it's when my clock says 3 PM. And so that would be, I know the reference of the words they're using, I know. And so that's how I came up with that.
Well, I think you could say the dog understands that sit means to sit down, like that they understand. I mean, so I don't think you can say understanding is always a conceptual grasp. Or why wouldn't you call that understanding, maybe?
All right. Right. You're saying the dog, but, so the question is, if you tell a dog to sit down, does he understand what sit down is?
Wait, so that could be a really tricky one, because
Yeah, that's a
are
good
they different
question.
concepts here? Are they the same word but different concepts? Or are they actually the same concept? I mean, that's sometimes maybe an optional or borderline case. Like you could create a new concept if you want for that, or you could just say, yeah, they're types of understanding. You just need a more narrow concept for conceptual. Or we can make distinctions between there's different kinds of understanding. You could have like a perceptual understanding or like an understanding a dog might have. It's more perceptual than it is conceptual. Or you could say
Yeah.
there's human understanding, there's conceptual understanding, or there could
Yeah.
be other kinds of understanding. And you could distinguish it that way, and that would be valid.
Yeah.
So you can have options like that. It's not strictly it has to be exactly genus differential every single time. You could swap it up a bit, say there's different types of it depending on the object of the understanding. Or you could differentiate between understanding could apply to all kinds of awareness or mental content, and that understanding could refers to you could refer to different types of understanding. Like each of any type
Right.
of grasping has a corresponding content, and so it gets tricky. Like there are kinds of understanding even.
Yeah.
Like you could
Yeah.
differentiate
Okay.
that way. You could say there's understanding, then you could do further narrow it down to say there's conceptual understanding. So there'd be a concept of understanding that would work too.
Right. That even with this though, like, okay, so I spent a while trying to get my head around clarifying this, but this is a mouthful and I just forget it later anyway. Like it just seemed kind of, well, I, I I don't think it actually helped me, to be honest, when even though I spent all this time, I was just left with this. And I'm like, if I step away and I don't look at it for a while, I'm not going to remember. Understanding is a kind of conceptual grasp, identifying concept or propositions, relationship to reality, and
Right.
other concepts. Like
Right.
that's not, I just forget all that anyway.
My own anecdotal experience is that no, I don't remember the definition. I can recreate the definition and that could suggest the validity of my thinking, but what I do to recall it is just the tree, really. I just imagine there's understanding and there's grasping, and then below it, there's different kinds of understanding. And that's really what I think of. I don't think about the definitions per se. I can recollect the definitions by taking it apart again,
Yeah.
but and
But
it's not hard to do, but like once you have the understanding, then you just recreate it. I think that's what happens.
but then that defeats the purpose of definition, by the way, because the reason that I thought, okay, here I get what the idea here is, and I'm curious to see what happens when you do it. The idea is that the genus and differentia are immediately at the forefront of your consciousness. And so all relevant are associations are recalled in like reading a proposition or in thinking. All the images that are most causally relevant, all the ideas, everything characteristic that is most causally relevant to the specific thing you're thinking about is more easily accessible. Versus, you know, if you define things in terms of understanding is when I use things that I know how to use. Like, then just imagine the kind of things your subconscious associates is like it'd be way harder. You maybe you'd spend 2 hours trying to think of the relevant thing, whereas if you had everything stored in a compact way, I can see how it would work. But that's in theory. I don't know yet. Like, you know, right now I'm seeing this and I'm like, well, this isn't working for me.
Well, in a way, by defining it here and then putting it into a hierarchy, then just by knowing where it is in the hierarchy itself gives you the definition. That you'll have the definition by just
Yeah,
merely recollecting the organization. I would
maybe.
agree that I think it's unspecified by Rand in what way this will how this could apply to practical thinking. Yes, there are definitions, but clearly we don't recall things by their definitions. And I think Rand would agree that we don't merely find the definitions and fit them into whatever we're arguing.
Right.
Rather, it's more a way of conceptualizing and setting the context and organizing the hierarchy of concepts. Making the definition does that. I mean, yes, it's important to create the definitions, but I would agree that you're not just recollecting these definitions. I would say that the definitions are inherent in your organization. So it's a matter of practicing. Can you pull out the definitions when you need them to recall or think about these specific things? Like when you're thinking of animals, or maybe you're not just thinking of the definition of like an organism that has locomotion. I mean, you don't think in those terms. You might think in specifically imagine some living thing that moves, and you recognize that as a living thing that moves, and that's all you really need to recognize it as. Because once
Yeah.
you like recall that essential, whatever the essential is, you can just then recreate it. I think maybe Rand would disagree that to recreate the definition, but I think I would just say that's maybe a problem in her theory, that an introduction you wish it couldn't get into, but unfortunately she didn't.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a couple of things that are still possible issues. Like I said before, yeah, I can see how it might work, but in my case, I'm not even using necessarily words I normally use, so I can see how that would, like, even all this is new to me. Mental process. I'm not even sure if you get to attribute or identity, to be honest, because what is it? Consciousness is identification. Existence is identity. Consciousness is identification. Something like that is the formula. So I don't even know if those things have a genus and differentia necessarily. Like uh,
Identity
in that
does
case,
not have a genus.
sorry,
Yeah, identity wouldn't have a genus.
yeah, but no, neither would existence. And so then, how do you even
Right, it
get to
doesn't.
that? How do you even get to that at the end of that? Like, there are a lot of things that are unclear here. But all I'm saying is, so far, like, it could go either way, right? But so far, it isn't necessarily. I feel like, yeah, I can see how disorganized knowledge can be, but I'm not clear yet on getting this. So it's like all the mental associations are recalled. I don't know yet if that's possible, but I'm trying. And I think one thing could potentially be, if we're just trying to eliminate what's like a problem, is that I don't use these words. Like, I don't talk in terms of cognition or think in terms of cognition. I don't think in terms of conceptual identification. I don't think in terms of conceptual grasp. So it would make sense. I just forget that as a genus completely. And mental activity, I don't think in those terms. I don't think in mental process. I don't even think in terms of process. So it makes sense that I then just forget those things, right? Um,
Probably, I mean, if you don't have a visual, if you don't
yeah,
have a
definitely. Exactly.
thing.
But if you did, maybe then it would be, if you had specific reference and I substituted some other word that's more relevant to me. I don't know. But see, I'm just saying, like, could go either way, right? Maybe it is, maybe in, like, I understand the argument that if you did store those things as like, even if I tried and cut this down now, understanding is, let's just say, uh, a kind of cognition identifying a concept's reference to reality. Like, suddenly that's cleaner and easier, right?
Yeah,
But I just don't know right now. With I'm getting closer, but I'm still not sure. It still feels a little off. But
I mean, on some level, you need to trust some of the knowledge that you do have. I understand that you want to clarify some of it, but to some extent, you got to acknowledge that a lot of your concepts are valid. It's just you can add clarity to them. It's not that you don't have the concepts, but you're adding information and clarity to strengthen these connections. And I think part of it is also trusting that whether you believe that actually taking time with this will gradually strengthen your memory and your ways of recalling things. At least my way of thinking and understanding psychology is that these things will gradually over time start to solidify in your mind. And this is more like the nature of how
yeah,
concepts are organized, which is why I have some other stuff for you later, that not just to say that I like the philosophy behind this, but that we could even use special science to further validate these kind of claims or
got it.
further demonstrate that there's an organization behind this and it is the nature of how your mind functions. And at some level, you just got to trust that your brain will function the way it should.
What does it mean to trust your brain?
In a way, to recognize that if you know the process of remembering things involves like gradual study, and that your brain has to make sometimes subconscious integrations or alter the neurons and all that, you gotta trust that eventually you're just waiting for it to bake, so to speak. You put the cake in the oven and you need to wait till it's done. You can't rush it. As much as it'd be nice to just snap your fingers and have it done, like you trust that you understand like the chemistry of baking to know that your cake will come out. In a way, it's like that with, I think, learning concepts. And I think
So,
it's valid to have some skepticism and whatnot, but a lot of learning is like testing it out, seeing what does it work out as it should. And
right.
obviously, it's not going to work immediately. You need some time to see if it works.
So you're basically saying then, would you say trusting your brain amounts to the learning process can be slow? Is that
Yeah,
basically
or
the
trusting that you've learned what learning takes. Trusting that you don't need to be skeptical of your understanding of learning in the first place. You gotta, on some level, you are building on what you know so far about learning. That there's certain things you need to do, and it won't come automatically. And also trusting that you have a valid concept of what learning is, or that so far you've had a um, like trust what you know. In other words, like you trust the
well,
laws of chemistry that you've in fact learned them, and you can bake a cake with that, and not just wondering every time, well, what if I never really understood what was going on? It doesn't come out this time.
well, I think that as far as not trusting any knowledge, that's not the case because then I wouldn't be
Right.
functioning at all,
Mm-hmm.
nor would I be capable of working or doing anything else. But I definitely think that there's a couple of things. So you can have concepts that you use, but you can't really think about them very well, which I can see how if you could think about them very well, like even understanding, right? Just imagine if you, I actually thought about this, asked myself, what is an ideologist? And I don't know what an ideologist is. I just know it has, let's say, it's got something to do with having a feeling and then believing in a set of beliefs, right? Like by faith or whatever. So then if I if I if I if I can't pinpoint exactly what understanding is on an explicit level, and I'm reading a book and I go, did I understand that or not? Then on some level I'm going by feeling, and so I could say maybe if this is what ideologist is. I'm a ideologist of understanding, and so I'm not saying I don't understand anything. I'm just saying that there is a massive loss in terms of learning and ability to conceptualize and think properly if you haven't really clarified your concepts. Because then, yeah, I am relying on feeling. Wouldn't you say so? Like, if I can't tell you what understanding is, am I not in many instances then going to have to rely on, do I feel like I understand this or not? If I can't conceptualize it explicitly.
Yeah, I think if you can't conceptualize it, then using it would have to be in some way emotional or non-rational or
Right,
not connected
exactly.
to reality.
And then
Yeah,
multiply that out by like 100 or 400 essential concepts, then you're
right.
operating in the same manner, right? It doesn't mean
Yes,
you're
I
not
agree.
functioning. It doesn't mean that there's no
Right.
understanding, but it does seem to mean that from what I've understood so far, and I have understood this, right, enough to be able to
Yes.
realize how important this is, that would be the default way of operating. Like a lot of it would be on not all of it, but a lot of it would be on feeling.
Yes, I mean that is true, and I think like, are you suggesting also that you would be using that even to at the very base when you're trying to question or validate your concepts?
Um, Sometimes, but the thing is with, I think with philosophy is that you can do that and you can get answers, meaning you can pursue a question and philosophy can tell you that's not a question. You're in vet, like you can't ask, for example, where did existence come from, right?
Right.
What is the place? A place that exists within existence. You can't, but it gives you, like you can get into dead ends in your thinking, but when you do it in philosophy, then I feel like there is a, what is it? It's like self-correcting because it gives you like it gives you starting points and it helps you, gives you guardrails for your thinking and so on. And so then you, through those errors, you can then learn. But in other fields, no, you're just going to go around in circles and circles and circles and circles. You're not going to get anywhere. So, um, But anyway, the whole reason I went into that is I'm just saying, like, yes, trust myself, but if that means don't keep aggressively questioning, then no, because I can see that, yeah, if you do, as pedantic as this seems, all I'm seeing is just potential. Like, I think, and I'm like excited. And, you know, obviously sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm not getting it, but I'm seeing potential. That's all. So,
okay, I think I'm seeing what you're saying better. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that's a big problem when we're thinking it. There's, I think sometimes a pull to go to this intuition or this feeling that, oh, here's an idea, I just want to run with it. And that's not always a great idea. And we do want to clarify our concepts, but there is a difficulty, of course, trying to, um, yeah, I see trusting yourself can't be just a absolute rule because you can't trust yourself if you're not thinking clearly. I mean, that's a reason to think that you need to re-question your ideas or reevaluate your decisions. And trusting yourself seems to be more like do your best to recognize when you've come to knowledge, and once you've, if it's been validated, if it is a valid concept, then you don't need to immediately go and try to have the most extreme accuracy in defining that as you can. It depends on which concept you're working on. Just
right.
because if you want to understand, talk about understanding, it doesn't mean you need to go back to then, well, what is identity? Like at some level, when you're thinking about it, you're accepting that you form the concept identity, you take for granted that it's accurate, at least insofar as you're talking about understanding. Then if you see, oh, can I not, is there a complete dead end here? Is there something I'm really getting stuck on? Then you might say, well, maybe it's another concept that's the problem. But if you're just trying to clarify what is understanding, then you don't really need to question everything around it. Just question as far as what is understanding? How do I understand it better? What are different ways I use the concept understanding? In what ways can I be more precise, more accurate, and more even rational about the way I use the term? Like you don't want to be vague, like understanding, but I actually mean knowledge. But maybe I don't mean either. I just mean being able to hear something like and respond to it. Is that, I mean, you could figure out that you're actually being vague all along. And you can say, oh, what I mean by that is this is understanding, this is grasping, this is, I don't knowing, and this is uncertainty. And then you could actually distinguish things better. And then your thinking can get better in
Yep.
that sense.
So then I agree with that. I think that, yeah, you're saying there's like a certain contextual aspect to it. And I mean, this is kind of close enough, right? I don't know if it's a kind of cognition, but if you go with
It's an
that,
improvement.
it's like, it does, I mean, this is the essence, I would say. A concept's reference to reality is the essence of understanding.
Yeah, it's a lot better than whatever it was probably. And now it's clear in your mind. And you could proceed with that, or you can say, does that change other concepts already? Or you might realize that you're doing pretty good on other concepts and you just continue on this one.
That it already changes my functioning, right? Because now if I read, I'm suddenly looking at things completely differently. I'll throw something out. I'm like, I don't know what this is. I honestly don't know what this means. So I'm just going to throw it out for now. I don't have time to pursue it. Whereas before, if I didn't have this, I could read like Carl Jung and think I'm understanding, but really it's just a jumble of words floating around in space. And
Yeah,
it does see that's like at the bottom somewhere operating now.
right.
But I had some questions that are more ones of precision that I wanted to put to you as
Okay.
well. Um, so I guess one would be if you have any thoughts. I found grasp kind of weird, but I guess we got into that last time and took ages. So let's skip that on the
Yeah.
genus. But in terms of like, you can understand a concept's reference to reality, but then what about in terms of implications of that concept, in terms of the applications, in terms of contextual integration, or do you have any thoughts on these that you think that won't take us too deep into a rabbit hole? Or
Implications.
maybe we can like if you think this is too much of a rabbit hole, we can just skip and go to sense of
I
life,
mean,
because
those are good questions, but I'm not sure what you're pursuing this for right now, or what are you trying to seek to understand by discussing implications and applications?
what can I say about like what I'm just trying to understand the relationship between understanding. So okay, I get what a concept's reference to reality are. Like, for example, I know what, let's say, reason refers to, but then what does it say about, like, to the, what are the implications of reason, and what does it indicate about my understanding if I know a few of them versus if I know a lot of them? And what about the applications? So, like, I mean, I guess, is there a difference between an implication and an application of a concept? uh does implication
Implication, I think implication makes me think of like, how does it change the structure of your other concepts? Does it make the other concepts move around? Do you need the
right,
other ones to move around to be consistent? That would
right,
be
right,
an
right.
implication. And
So
I guess
that's contextual integration then, right?
um, I would say so, because you're seeing which concepts are altered in which way, not just a universal, everything changes in this one way, but it depends on the concept and it depends the way it's organized. So it depends on the way you've learned your concept. Applications would be not just the organization of these concepts, but your use of that concept even in daily life and related concepts. Like you said about like, oh, reading Carl Jung, you could say like, oh, I don't really understand the words he's saying. Maybe I can put together the words grammatically, but I don't know what he means. And in
Yeah,
a way, that's getting you to say like, maybe call out Carl Jung on his own bullshit rather than just accepting like, oh, I kind of get it. He's like, well, I kind of get it, but the reason it's only kind of is because he doesn't really refer to anything in reality. You could criticize his ideas better, or you
I'd
can
say no on
evaluate
that,
his,
but
or
yeah, anyway,
whatever it
go on, I'll
might
tell
be,
you.
whatever your
Yeah,
decision is. You could
yeah.
say, oh, maybe they aren't. That he is referring to things in reality, even if they sound weird. What it means is I just need to clarify his concepts by finding the reference. I mean, maybe he's
Yes.
vague, but you can make him precise with the reference and alter his concepts in a way that they are referring to reality in a more coherent way.
So on a practical level, I'm simply just, if I read something that has too many abstract terms, I just throw it out. It's not even a judgment. It's like, well, I'm not at the point where I know what the hell that, if I'm honest,
Right.
I don't know what the hell this person's speaking about. This is a waste of my time. So I'm just going to throw it out into
Yeah,
the
in that
street.
sense, yeah, like, or put it aside for now, because I'm not going to be able to honestly evaluate it if I really can't make heads or tails of it. And maybe it's your fault. Maybe it's just a bad writer. I mean, you can't necessarily even blame yourself. It's just that it's not really coherent and you can't make sense of it now. And you have to recognize that you can't make sense of it and just put it aside. It could mean that you just need more time. Like if I start opening a book on quantum physics, like I won't know what's going on. I'll say I don't get it. I can't say if it's true or false. It's like
Yeah.
I just don't get it. I'll put it aside.
Yeah. That was interesting what you said about implications, because, or application, you just made me realize that application isn't necessarily a part of understanding, because you can understand, how to serve a tennis ball, and you could literally understand the mechanics of the body and everything else, but um, the actual application is a necessity, but it's a different aspect, right? You can understand, and then there is that need to practice and internalize if it involves use of muscles or whatever it is. And it's probably similar in like in other things. So it just means when you could apply it, but your application would be bad and slow and very deliberate. But you could still say the person has understanding. So you just made me realize that, which is cool. So I wouldn't say application is part of understanding. They're
Yeah, I
separate.
think I have a thought experiment with that we can get into more later. I have a
What
paper
is
to
it?
make.
I'll write it down so we can come back.
Mary's Room.
Mary's room. Is this from uh Dennett?
No, it's just a well-known um, thought experiment from some philosopher.
Oh,
His name
cool.
is Jackson. I don't. Nobody else I really know, but the idea being simply that you can be in a room. Imagine you grew up in a room. You couldn't see or do anything, but you read every book about the color red. You knew every fact about the color red. You know, like what a spectrum is. You learn where on the spectrum it is. You learn that fire trucks are red. You learn that apples are red. But you've never experienced red, seen red or anything. You've just been in this pure white room and you can't see anything. So do you understand what red is? If you've only had the facts of it, but never have experienced red, do you understand red? And that's almost like what I'm saying about application. Like, yeah, we could have all these particular facts, but maybe we would say that you still don't truly have the fullest understanding or grasp
I
because you
think
don't have
that,
that full knowledge.
but that goes to the definition here, because in that case, we're speaking about perceptual data. Here I'm talking
Right.
about identifying a concept's relationship to reality. So in that case, it seems like the question is, do you understand a tree? It's an equivalent, which I put down as a near relative, which
Yeah.
is, it doesn't apply. Like maybe there is a way, there's a concept that's necessary, but at least in my use of the concept, which has a specific referent in
Right.
reality, so it does exist. In that case, you would say it's not the term understanding isn't applicable. What are your thoughts on that? This is
I
just
do agree that the thought experiment is more about the actual phenomenon of perception. But I mean, there's more details we'll get into later about
yeah. We could,
when we get
let's
into philosophy of
definitely.
mind. But it's
I
more
wrote it
like a
down.
connection you can be aware of, but we'll explore it later.
I wrote it down, so we should come back to understanding. I've got a whole thing
Yeah.
full of concepts, so we'll have tons of time
Yeah.
to. All right, so I thought we'd try get into this, and I was just curious if you.
Sense of
I
death.
really like. Yeah, I actually quite like this topic. I find it fascinating
Okay.
because it's not. You know, I once they start getting into politics and stuff, it's not. It's just too far away from things I don't already understand. But this is like,
Yeah.
you know, seems pretty close to metaphysics and epistemology, and so it's pretty interesting. So this is, I can't remember what essay this is from, but it's talking about, I think it's from the chapter on man, and it's talking about the key concept in the formation of the sense of life is the term important.
Yeah. I
Uh,
remember the essay. Yeah. This is
which one?
Rand's essay.
Oh,
I
it's
think,
an essay. Okay,
I think it's the second one. I don't know. I'm just going off the top of my head. But yeah.
right. And so let's see. Means quality. Okay, so important is a metaphysical term. Okay. All right. So here is where I'm interested in, um, you know, like these kind of what she calls metaphysical value judgments. Like, is the universe? I mean, no one thinks in those terms explicitly, which is what I find interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and so, let's see. Here we go. Here's more of them that I was curious about. It is important to understand things. It is important to obey my parents. Like, is this metaphysical? Like, I'm just, how do you, like, what else is in there if that's, uh, you know, it's important to please people? Like, I like apples. That I wouldn't say that's metaphysical.
Yeah.
Um,
I've never seen a good clarification of why it had to be a metaphysical value judgment. I mean, they are value judgments, obviously, but metaphysical value judgments. I mean, I guess you're saying about the nature of reality, but in a way that doesn't help clarify anything. Yeah, any judgment is about a fact of reality.
right.
I mean, it's just referring to what what you've judged about reality, whatever it is you've judged, whether it's factual or not, is what you've judged about reality. I mean, of course, it's metaphysical. I mean, I don't know what other kind of value judgment there could be.
It seems like what I understood is that when she said metaphysical judgments, which contradicts what I'm seeing here about obeying parents and pleasing other people, but putting
Yes.
that aside for now, I thought they were just like judgments on man. So when I say man, I mean, you know, people in general, or my life,
Yeah.
or my being, in a very broad sense. I thought, do you also get to some fundamental questions when you make judgments on man? Like, do you get to things to like, is the universe comprehensible or not, or do you, or not? Are those always going to be at the base of beliefs? That's what I was. trying to work out. So
I think Rand is claiming that there is always going to be, we could always reduce it or find within it a judgment about the nature of reality itself, about it being knowable and things like that on those very fundamental level. Based on the context of what I've seen Rand talk about, like she would say that that judgment is always there. You can't have, it is important to obey my parents without having somewhere in there some implication or implicit judgment about reality. It's going to say something. Obviously, it's a complex way to get to this point in your judgments. How do you conclude that it is important to obey my parents? On some level, it's what they think about identity and consciousness will lead them to that point. And I think Rand is trying to argue that what whatever person has this judgment, it is in some way connected to their more fundamental judgments, like about is reality knowable. And I think that might be too strong a claim because I think we could say that yes, somewhere along their line of abstractions, they are making a judgment of or something more fundamental than merely it is important to to obey my
right,
parent.
right.
But their error is not necessarily all traceable to an error of judging reality. It could be some other error along the way. It could be something to do with like um, the importance of ethics is to work with others because I've identified in reality that no person can live alone or no man's an island or something like that. Like I wouldn't say it goes all the way down to a failure to say that reality is knowable, but
Yeah,
it would be some failure or at least disagreement that man can act independently. So there's some judgment there, like it's impossible to act independently. Whatever reason the error is, it's still there. Or if
right.
it even is an error, but it doesn't necessarily trace down all the way to the root of everything.
What? Yeah, that makes sense to me. I agree with that. Like there will be like something like this won't necessarily, like I don't see how it necessarily traces down to some deep metaphysical. At least I can't see it. But I think actually now that I'm looking at this, these she's just giving examples in this case of a sense of life, and then here is where she talks about the metaphysical value judgments as
Yeah,
like, whether the universe is knowable or not. The other thing is,
yeah,
so something else I want to ask you is when you talk in these terms, like when you say, for example, I think I listened to some, I'll write some down. So one example of a metaphysical value judgment might be happiness is impossible to man on earth. And then I can put it down here, maybe I'll just copy paste in a second. And then thinking is futile, communication with other men is futile. This is from like the Brandon thing that I found. And then what else was in there? Something, let's just go with that because they're pretty extreme and good. Okay, so with those, like let's say these are metaphysical value judgments and they're probably pretty close, right?
yeah.
How the thing is like, what does it mean to hold those? Because if that was true and you did hold that down to the root, there's no way you could be consistent unless you'd be dead. Like that. So when someone holds, let's say, a metaphysical judgment like the one she gave, which is, these ones, whether the universe is knowable or not, whether man has the, like, what does it even look like to not believe? Like, you know what I'm saying? How can you consist? Well, yeah, that's what I'm interested in. Like, psychologically, it's just not possible to hold those, basically.
It's very destructive, in fact, to hold those for long. And I can think of even examples of people who have such a despairing view of life that they are literally suicidal, even violent to others because of that belief.
Right.
Like I could think of historical examples. Like I mean, I wish I could just point to some easily known fact, but like I know some artists, like one who was a nihilist who he's explicitly called himself a nihilist, and Edvard Munch worked with him. But Edvard Munch was a nihilist himself, but this guy was like a nihilist also an anarchist, but in the more like violence or chaos for its own sake, nothing anything political as much as like no understanding is possible, or there are no values that are actually mean anything. They're just whatever the hell you want them to be. And he had a very despairing view on life, and even like you can't understand things, or even his way of writing was more about outright destruction of things because he had all these beliefs about like I guess unknowability and that there's no actually meaning to life except whatever we want it to be, and that could be itself be despairing. And he was very suicidal in many ways. And like a biography I was reading is about it very much as describing how this guy was suicidal. I mean, did some violent acts too, and sent to jail. Like, really, this terrible life. He's a
Yeah.
somewhat well-known person in Norway, but it would be like a clear example of somebody who does have some hateful ideas, or forget what I
Right.
even judge it as, just someone who is a nihilist is acting this way.
Yeah.
Someone who declares himself a nihilist is
Right.
giving the ideas, and he's actually has clear evidence of, say, a despairing and damaging life. And in a way, you could say it actually harmed his flourishing. And yeah, if he acted even more consistently, he would be dead, but he's almost dead anyway, being
Right.
suicidal and things like that. So yeah, he was practically dead anyway, wanting to not even exist sometimes. I mean, that's pretty
Right.
extreme.
So that you gave the example of, in this case, someone who's explicit, and then you see them in it, like you see the
Right.
results as well. Oh, okay. So I guess then it's you cannot hold them consistently, but it's just a matter of to what extent you subconsciously hold them, right?
Probably yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, to what extent you put it into your life, put it into action, which in that extreme case, which in real life case, it was caused direct damage to his life and his flourishing. Not just like, oh, he's going to die, but like his flourishing was so damaged that maybe he would die sooner than he would have otherwise. Or
Right.
like he it seems like he had barely any reason to eat. I mean, he did things kind of like out of impulse, and these I don't know impulses. I couldn't say why exactly, but I
Right.
mean I've heard of other nihilists who have done the same thing, but really despairing people, and that was a common characteristic. I know that's more anecdotal and biographical, but this
But
is
it's
the way. I
good.
mean,
It's
yeah,
good.
but they are clear concretes I can think of, and at least that there are people who have made this connection. The hard part is, well, what are even more examples? Is just this a rare, strange circumstance, or can I think of other circumstances even where the opposite is true, that somebody holds on very explicit benevolent beliefs and that their quality of life and their flourishing was in some way better than maybe a belief they had before,
Right.
things like that. Like, did they improve their life? Or to what extent are they better than they would have been? Maybe we could ask. Like, I'm sure Rand had a lot of great ideas, but I didn't think she was a very great person personally. Like, on a personal level, she didn't seem very good of a person
Yeah.
despite her ideas. And we could say, even within there, maybe she had some pessimism in her that led her maybe up to a more negative place than she would have been. Because I've read about like Rand herself wasn't very, she didn't think it'd be promising at all to tell other people about objectivism. She
She
didn't think
didn't
there was a
think what?
point. There was like any point in telling other people about objectivism beyond Atlas Shrugged. Like she didn't think about like having courses like Peacock would, or even have Brandon give courses at the Nathaniel Brandon Institute about objectivism. She was
Right.
skeptical of its value. She was like, I don't know, like basically like saying nobody's gonna listen anyway. They're not ready for it, or that kind of thing. And Brandon is the one who insisted we should bring these ideas to more people. They want to listen. They want to hear you. They're interested. And she was willing to let him try, and then his actions convinced her that it's worth it. But in some way, that can say like she had some pessimism in herself that might have affected her life, and she improved to the extent that like she was willing to hear Brandon say you should be benevolent about it. You shouldn't assume the worst, things like that. And
Yeah.
it led to even better things in her life than she would have had. Imagine if she never told anyone, she probably would have. Who knows what her life would have been? Nobody would know her name, and that's probably be it. And even her own life wouldn't be as full, and as conflicting as it may have been, I'm sure it was better than if she just had a pessimistic view of life and just didn't even try despite her explicit identifications.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't know enough about what she did and so on, but let's say
Right.
like that the metaphysical judgments in terms of sense of life are powerful, and it's hard to, it goes back to like, what are the implications of a concept that you hold? Another thing, I think that's pretty hard to work out, right? Um, I don't know. I guess that's also a question of like, if you have a certain sense of life, what would be optimal environments for you to be in that would help you change it in a way that's positive. But
Yeah.
that's a separate thing.
I mean, that is
But
a challenge for sure.
but I was also thinking about like, what do you think about if the meta, if in like philosophy there are some basic questions, right? Like, what is it and how do you know it? For example, like metaphysics and epistemology, or like, where am I? What is it? Where am I? How do I know it? What should I do about it? And so would there not be the same in metaphysical value judgments? Because if we start going to like, it is important to obey parents, that doesn't make sense. But how do you work out what the core metaphysical value judgments would be? Would there not be a few that are all encompassing in some way, or like just include everything that you need to in that specific?
I mean, the knowability of the universe seems to be encompassing a lot. I'm not sure I understand your question though.
So I mean, we've got here, she says the view of, so in terms of metaphysical value judgment involves the answers to such questions as whether the universe is knowable or not, whether the man has the power of choice or not, whether he can achieve his goals in life or not. So like, I'm just wondering, she hasn't given a complete list of metaphysical value judgments, but I'm wondering how you'd work out what they are, because then if you're talking about like looking at someone's life or your own life, how do you work, because everything is implicit, right? I don't think in terms of like, oh, I like, not before I read philosophy, I don't walk around going, oh, I acted on the premise of the universe being an incomprehensible chaos. So like, if you could explicitly list all the metaphysical value judgments that would be possible, then it would take you a step closer to being able to then infer what yours are, because it's the only thing you can do, right? Since one, you don't act on them consistently, and two, you don't hold them in explicit form.
I think a lot of it is asking yourself why. Like, I might that might be, yeah. Like you can tell yourself, if you told yourself I should obey my dad and become a doctor, you can ask yourself why should I do that, or why is that the case, or something like that. You
Right.
could trace that back and then just keep going back until you find some question that seems to be encompassing something very important, or something you didn't like to acknowledge what is true nonetheless. I mean, people can, you might say and realize that, like, oh yeah, I'm afraid to think for myself, at least about my career. Like, you might not want to admit that to yourself, that you've been, for example, if somebody's just been used to following along what their dad said, like, oh, go do well in school, things like that. You have no particular problem with it, but maybe by the time, like, if you're 25, you decide you want to get an MD, you might have to ask yourself, is it, you might be afraid even to tell yourself, yeah, I was being dependent on others by thinking, even though I'm independent almost everywhere else, here I wasn't. And I think maybe it's the honesty to recognize that isn't, in fact, what you've done. And you could say, oh, yeah, maybe I'm kind of screwed up with my value judgments here. Or even say that that's not how I want to be, so I'm going to change it. Like you
Yeah.
recognize that it's not what's leading you to flourishing and all that. I think that's really the best way you can do it. Otherwise, you either maybe ask other people their thoughts, but I don't think you can just know it without going backwards and tracing like the chain of reasons why you do things.
Right.
Or
I
you could
spoke to a
ask it
friend.
differently.
Yeah,
Or you
go
could
on.
even ask it different, like, how do I know it is important to obey my parents? You can go back, then how do I know that? Then how do I know that? And keep going like that. And you might see something about knowing, like, oh, you might go back to say like, oh, thinking is futile, so that's why I ended up here. You can find out your own, how you got there at least.
Right.
Even if you don't know why others did it, at least you could probably figure out yourself. The difficult part is just being honest and making sure you're not just picking the preferred reasoning rather than the actual reason.
But it reminds me of, I spoke to a friend last night and she's also studying psychology. And she said that we were talking about CBT. And she was saying that I asked her about CBT and like she says sometimes the method of, what you said sounded like CBT, where they ask something like, what would that mean if your friends didn't come? And okay, if you're all right, so it means you're boring. What would it mean if you're boring or whatever? And you just keep trying to go deeper and deeper to find whatever the core belief is.
Right.
But the thing is that people don't. This is what I got from the conversation, is that people don't always know. Like there'll be a point where you get to and you stop. Like, oh, I'm a boring person, and there's nothing beyond that. You know what I'm saying? Like, because if something isn't explicit, then how could you go deeper? I don't know. Anyway, that's all.
So you
I
made me
mean, I
think of
guess it seems
something.
like that would be the only way. You just have to keep trying to
Yeah.
put out all the evidence together in all these different situations and work out what the implicitly help, like find words for what the implied reverse engineered thing is, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So you made me think of something. The guy who came up with rational behavior therapy, which was then used as the basis for CBT. Like I told you about it before, how it seems related to objectivism, or at least implicitly. I
Right.
found out later that I think it was a couple of weeks ago. I was just looking into it, see what the actual connection with Rand was, or
See
objectivism, if there
what?
was
Sorry,
one. His
the video
connection with
started. Okay.
objectivism, if there even was one. I saw that there was a spat he had with Nathaniel Brandon, and they actually knew each other for a while, even for years. They knew each other, not like close friends, but they discussed ideas. Maybe they had some political disagreements, I think. But I guess Brandon was interested enough in his ideas that he liked talking to him, thought it was worthwhile to talk with. Even the guy used even Brandon as maybe a reference to join the APA, the American Psychological Association. So like they had some respect for each other and they communicated with each other. And one time they had a debate at Columbia and it kind of got heated, but like he spoke first and was talking about like why objectivism makes people dogmatic. He probably went in there with a not in not fairly with not in good intentions, but he did seem to understand what objectivism is and understand how to talk in terms of objectivism. And he did seem, I mean, he's even talking about objectivism and even arguing with Brandon in terms of even bringing up Atlas Shrugged. Even it seems like he has some understanding and respect for at least the way you think about ideas and rationality and connecting things to what you see, but really disagreeing on other more abstract things like is selfishness any good, which he didn't think it was a good thing, or he disagreed on a lot of the other ethical principles, especially.
Right.
So I don't know what he thought about epistemology, but I found it really interesting that he really did have a connection with objectivism. He even published ideas against it, but enough so that I don't think you can create a criticism of something like he did unless you actually have some implicit understanding of what you're dealing with, or even at least if you're going to be friends with Brandon for a while, you're probably going to agree on at least in terms of psychology on a basic level, like
Right.
like tracing our ideas back or understanding what our ideas refer to and tracing your ideas back, like we just discussed. It seems like part of that way of thinking, and that's been in psychology for a while. And people, it's not like Brandon was a fringe dude. Like he had some respect in the field. It wasn't like he was a nutso guy that couldn't join the APA or something, but like a respectable person that had something to say, and he influenced Rand himself, Brandon. So I'm just pointing out that I think there's like a connection there. It's not like Rand was isolated from psychology as a whole. Brandon did influence her and her ideas. And I'm sure it influenced her ideas about art by the time she wrote about it.
Right. Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Those look like good waffles in your background. I didn't notice until just the waffles.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm just